In the heart of a village surrounded by endless meadows, deep forests, and winding streams, life in the Middle Ages beat to the rhythm of seasons and survival, and no element of that life symbolized the peasants' ingenuity more than the animals they raised, hunted, and used down to the last sinew. From the moment of slaughter to the final repurposing of hoof or hide, every single part of the animal became a necessity rather than waste, a vital tool rather than a forgotten scrap, and the people who lived in cottages of thatched roofs and earth-packed floors understood better than most that survival depended not on what they had, but how well they used it. As the early morning mist curled across the fields, farmers would lead their pigs, goats, or cattle to slaughter, not with cruelty but with ritualistic practicality, often invoking blessings over the animals and thanking them with gestures passed down through generations. Because taking a life was never done lightly, meat was precious, and more than just food, it was a promise of warmth, tools, trade, and continuity. The muscle and flesh of the animal, of course, became meat, and whether salted, dried, smoked, or stewed in an iron cauldron over a hearth's flickering fire, it was not consumed in gluttony, but measured with care. Pork might be ground and packed into sausages using cleaned intestines as casings, beef salted in large barrels to last through the harshest winter months, and even offal, liver, heart, kidneys eaten quickly after slaughter, often boiled into hearty soups or mixed with grains in blood puddings. Blood, fresh and warm, was stirred with oats or barley, seasoned with herbs, and poured into skins to form sausage mixtures that became staples for families with few other luxuries, and for peasants whose hands were calloused and bodies sunburnt, it was a blessing in a bowl. Intestines and stomachs were cleaned and used as containers long before glass or pottery were common in every household. They were sometimes used to store food or to encase mixtures of herbs or salts for trade and medicinal practices. The skin, whether from pig or cow or sheep, was stripped carefully, scraped with knives, soaked in lime to loosen hair, and either tanned into leather for shoes, belts and pouches, or parchment for writing. The bleached, scraped, and dried hides of sheep and calves often becoming precious pages in illuminated manuscripts or legal documents in castles and abbeys. Leather workers would turn the tough hides into rugged boots for ploughing fields, horse tack, or knife sheaths, while finer leather might be used in gloves, bags, or bookbinding for clergy and scholars, the scent of cured hide lingering in the dusty halls of monastic scriptoria. Bones were smashed or carved, their hollowed marrow first scooped out and boiled into broths rich in collagen, a curative thought to strengthen joints and restore energy, and the bones themselves were shaped into tools, awls, needles, dice, buttons, and even flutes for minstrels who played in market squares. Antlers of deer, brought home by hunters who stalked the edge of royal forests, were turned into handles for knives or ornamental combs, while their meat was shared with neighbors or preserved for feast days, and their sinews dried and used as strong threads for sewing tough materials or binding arrows in place. Horns of cows and goats, hollowed out, were turned into drinking vessels, powder flasks, or even used to call villagers together with low mournful sounds echoing through the glen, while hooves were boiled down into glue, a strong and versatile binding agent used in woodworking and repairs. Fat, too, rendered down into lard or tallow, was not just cooking material but fuel for candles, smooth and slow burning, lighting homes and chapels alike with their flickering glow during long winter nights when darkness stretched for hours and people read scripture, spun yarn, or whispered stories by their light. Brains, rich in fat and phosphorus, were mashed and mixed into early tanning processes to soften hides, especially in areas where bark or alum was scarce, and though rarely eaten except in desperation, they were sometimes cooked in egg and vinegar to create peculiar delicacies for feast tables. Even the tails of animals like that of an ox were slow cooked into gelatin-rich stews, thick and sustaining, and tongues were boiled or roasted and sliced thin for eating with coarse bread or small pickled vegetables, especially by those lucky enough to work in manor kitchens or castle halls. Hair from horses and pigs was collected for brushes or rope. Boar bristles made sturdy tooth cleaners or paint brushes, while horsehair could be woven into upholstery, fishing lines, or even the stiffening layer beneath fine garments worn by nobles. The stomach of a ruminant, especially the sheep, provided the vital rennet used to curdle milk into cheese, and every dairymaid knew how to preserve just the right part of a calf's stomach to create curds that would feed the manor's table. Cow dung, while not a part of the animal per se, was cherished just as fiercely. It dried into fuel, lined walls for insulation, and fertilized the fields that would one day feed the very same animals again, completing a circle of use that had neither beginning nor end. In times of plague or famine, when livestock died or were too scarce to slaughter, even scavenged remains were stripped and used, bones from old carcasses crushed into powder for bone meal, skins too decayed for tanning used to patch roofs or boots, and teeth strung into charms to ward off evil or hung over a baby's crib to bring protection. Medieval butchers were craftsmen in their own right, often licensed and regulated in towns to ensure that no part of the beast went to waste, and their apprentices learned not only to carve with skill but to preserve every tendon, every strip of sinew, every shard of gristle, often selling tripe or trotters in open markets or door to door among poorer neighbours. In cities, tanners worked on the outskirts, their foul-smelling vats of urine, lime and rotting flesh kept far from the bakeries and alehouses, and there the hides were softened, dyed, stretched and sold to cobblers and saddlers who needed tough but workable material. In monasteries, monks who raised sheep for wool also relied on the full body of the animal, wool for clothing and trade, meat for food, skins for parchment, and dung for warming greenhouses or growing herbs behind cloister walls, while their gardens blossomed under the careful recycling of every ounce of animal contribution. Hunting dogs wore collars made of boiled leather, their bowls carved from old cow horn or wood polished with sheep fat, and the noblemen who hunted deer and boar in forests often gifted the organs and less desirable cuts to their servants, who in turn made stews thickened with barley and wild onions, thankful for the chain of providence that gave them sustenance. Children learned young to help in these rituals, scraping hides with stone or shell tools, fetching salt and lye for curing, gathering hair and feathers for stuffing pillows or insulation in winter bedding, or blowing into hollowed bone pipes to scare away crows from the fields. Even feathers plucked from chickens, ducks or geese were sorted, flight feathers for quills and arrows, down for stuffing garments, and lesser plumes for dusters or decor on hats. The beaks and claws of birds might become small tools or trinkets, and when larger game like swan or peacock was served at noble feasts, the feathers were sometimes saved to redress the bird for display after cooking, making it appear freshly alive and glamorous in the centre of a lord's table. Sheep shearing, a seasonal rhythm of its own, was followed by careful collection not only of wool, but of the lanolin, natural oils secreted by the fleece, used in soap making or as balms for cracked skin, and every fleecer knew how to separate the better wool for spinning from the coarser bits used in stuffing sacks or felting for cloaks. Horses, once they died, were mourned especially by the villagers who had grown up beside them, but their meat might still be eaten in hard times, their hides turned into strong reins, their tails into brushes, and their skulls hung in barns to ward off bad spirits, as folklore and function intertwined. The sounds of daily life, the slicing of knives, the bubbling of fat, the rustling of straw as skins dried, the scraping of hide across stone, and the soft chant of monks as they turned animal skin into holy script, filled the medieval world with a visceral hum of human endurance, all of it rooted in the respectful and efficient use of beasts. There were few luxuries and fewer certainties, but among them was the surety that no part of a living creature would be squandered, that each part served a role in the ever-turning wheel of agrarian life, and even the smells, rank and ripe and thick with purpose, spoke to a world where people knew the worth of sweat, sacrifice, and the sinew of the land itself. From abbey to alehouse, from hovel to manor, from field to forest, the medieval man, woman and child lived closely with the creatures that fed them, clothed them, warmed them, and gave meaning to their work. And in their humble, grounded, tactile use of every piece of the animal, they found a kind of reverence born not of waste but of wonder, not of abundance but of artistry, making the ordinary profound with every stitch, every flame, every bite, and every bone carefully carved and cherished as one more thread in the fabric of survival. And so the rhythm of medieval life continued, each village bound not by written law alone, but by the silent agreements made between people and the earth, between human hands and the backs of animals that laboured, fed and died alongside them. In one such village nestled between the fens and rising moorlands, the year had turned harsh, and the harvests of the previous autumn had failed. The thatched roof cottages stood hunched against the cold, their timber frames dark with soot and moisture, and within the wattle walls, families clustered by the fire not for comfort alone, but to survive. The parish priest had blessed the fields, and the reeve had measured out the stores, but the numbers fell short. Hunger crouched like a wolf at every door. In such seasons, when the granary bins grew empty and even the rats seemed leaner, the importance of livestock grew tenfold. Not only the meat they could provide, but the countless hidden gifts locked within each hoof, hide and bone. The village butcher, a man called Edric, whose hands bore the nicks of decades at the blade, was summoned to the Lord's Hall with a quiet request. The last oxen, the plough beasts grown too old for further toil, would be slaughtered, not for feast but for endurance. He did not protest, though he looked into the eyes of the lead ox with something like sorrow. The animal had pulled its share of furrows, bled its sweat into the soil, but now its body would serve a different purpose. Edric's apprentices prepared the knives, heated the iron cauldron in the yard, and fetched buckets of clean water from the well, while the villagers gathered in a slow, reluctant procession. No death was taken lightly. The ox was felled quickly, prayers whispered over its still heart, and the work began. The first task was the division of meat, ribs, flanks, tongue, heart, all wrapped in cloth or packed with salt. The liver was sliced thin and cooked over the embers to feed the workers immediately, while the kidneys were chopped with herbs and preserved in jars of vinegar. The fat was separated with care, some to be rendered into dripping for bread, some reserved for candles, the rest boiled into tallow and poured into clay moulds for trade with the tinker who would pass through in spring. The bones, stripped clean, were cracked open by the smith to scoop the marrow and boiled into broth that would feed the elderly and sick. The stronger bones were saved for handles, tools, or instruments, and the curved pieces would be shaped into buckles or toggles. The head was carefully removed and boiled, the cheeks and jowls fed to the priest and his serving girl, the brain mixed into a lye solution, and later used by the tanner in the outskirts of the village to cure hides with a soft finish. That same tanner arrived with his sons and collected the skin, still warm and pliable, rolling it up like a tapestry to be soaked in urine and lime, before the long, smelly process of scraping, stretching, and tanning it into hide. That hide would in time become boots for the reeve, aprons for the blacksmiths, and sheaths for the knives the butcher's apprentices carried. The tail of the ox was cooked into gelatin and stored in earthen pots. Its hooves went to the glue pot, the bubbling mixture stirred day and night to yield a paste used in repairing cartwheels, binding broken tools, or patching furniture in the manor. Children, drawn by curiosity, were given the task of collecting the ox's hair from its shedding hide. They plucked and bundled it, some to be used in rope making, some for stuffing mattresses or insulating wall cracks with straw and mud. The horns were carved with patience and skill. One would become a powder flask for the gamekeeper's pouch, another hollowed into a drinking horn passed between the reeve and the hayward at gatherings. Scraps of the inner stomach lining were cut and cleaned, dried flat over woven reeds, and used in the coming weeks as sausage casings or even as makeshift parchment when nothing else could be spared. Nothing was discarded, nothing thrown aside. Even the blood, collected in buckets lined with bracken, was stirred with oats and seasoned with salt and pennyroyal, stuffed into cleaned intestines and smoked over the hearth into black pudding. The smell of blood and smoke drifted across the fields, mixing with the sharp sting of winter air and the faint scent of lye from the tanner's yard. The women of the village took the rendered tallow and dipped string after string into the hot fat, creating candles with careful, repetitive rhythm. Each taper added light to a cottage that would otherwise be in darkness for 13 hours of the night. They sang softly as they worked, old ballads whose verses remembered other winters, other beasts, other sacrifices. One young girl, barely old enough to reach the cauldron, was given the task of collecting the ox's teeth. She strung them together into a charm for a younger brother who was ill and weak with fever. Her grandmother told her it would keep away spirits that made the lungs heavy and the breath shallow. Superstition, perhaps, but in the absence of medicine, such tokens became hope made tangible. The bones of the legs were soaked and then whittled into playing dice, small cubes that the boys used to play games of chance beside the hearth. Others were shaped into styluses used on wax tablets by the steward's clerk. Even as the villagers used the ox, their minds drifted to the sheep and goats penned in barns. Their wool was a resource as vital as bread. When the wind howled across the moor and the sleet fell sideways, it was wool cloaks and blankets, spun thick and felted tight, that kept warmth in the bones. Spinning wheels turned slowly, and looms clicked and knocked under rafters where smoke clung in dark corners. The lanolin from raw fleece, slick and yellow, was massaged into cracked fingers, easing pain and sealing cuts. In one cottage, a woman stirred a mixture of mutton tallow and beeswax, melting them into salves used for burns, frostbite, and even childbirth. The fleece left over after spinning, too coarse or tangled, was packed into walls with mud or used to stuff the wooden shoes worn by ploughmen. Goat horns, curled and hard, were polished into combs, their teeth fine enough to catch lice and fleas that plagued the unwashed hair of peasants. Their hides were thinner, more flexible, and perfect for making gloves or pouches to carry dried herbs and charms. Even their urine was sometimes collected to bleach cloth or as a component in tanning solutions, another piece in the intricate mosaic of use that characterized medieval life. Come spring, when a calf was born weak or still, its skin was not buried but turned to parchment. Monks from the nearby priory would sometimes come on foot, carrying payment in dried fish or ink, asking for vellum, fine parchment scraped smooth for scripture. That parchment would over months be trimmed, sewn, and covered in gold leaf, becoming part of the Gospels read aloud to villagers who never learnt to read. Thus, the same calf whose body fed a dog and whose skin was scraped with bone knives lived on in the pages of sacred text. In time, a merchant passed through the village with wares from distant towns. He bought from the tanner sheets of pigskin to use as book covers, horn cups for taverns in the next shire, and candles which he traded to city folk who knew only wax from bees, not from beasts. One boy, a shepherd's son, had kept a careful bundle of sheep bones. He shaped them into flutes, practiced for hours until he could mimic the call of a raven or the song of the pipit that nested in hedgerows. He played for coins at market, his music eerie and beautiful, echoing through the stalls where tripe and trotters were sold next to salted hides and black sausages. An old blind man, once a soldier, traded him a fox-tooth charm in return for a tune that reminded him of his youth. The charm, in time, hung from the boy's neck when he stood watch over the lambing pens, and he swore it kept the wolves at bay. In the heart of the manor, the Lord's steward made tallies of how many candles remained, how many hides had been tanned, how many hooves boiled for glue. He kept careful ledgers, each page made from animal skin, each number scratched with a quill plucked from a goose. The ink was made from soot and oak galls, sometimes mixed with bile from a pig's liver to give it permanence. His cloak, lined with fur from rabbits caught in snares, kept him warm while he wrote, and at his feet lay a dog fed on scraps of boiled organ meat, and stale bread soaked in broth made from boiled ox tails and bones. When spring finally broke through the ice-crusted earth, new lambs stumbled on wobbly legs, and children returned to the meadows, collecting feathers and old shed antlers from the woods. A dead deer, found by the edge of the wood where wolves had left only scraps, was scavenged by boys who brought back the skull, now sun-bleached and clean. The antlers were sawed off and filed down, some for tools, others for charms. The hide, already stiff, was soaked and softened and used to patch a leaky section of roof. Life began again with green shoots and longer days, but the lessons of winter remained carved into every knuckle and sinew, every horn cup and stitched leather belt. The people did not just use animals, they wove their bodies into the very fabric of their lives. A pig became more than meat, it became light, warmth, tools, music, and medicine. A cow became more than a source of milk. It became the parchment for laws and psalms, the glue in a carpenter's hands, the bellows in a blacksmith's forge. In these acts of usage, nothing was separate. Animal, human, and earth were bound in a cycle so old and essential that to waste a tendon was to dishonor life itself. And through this cycle, the medieval world continued, one hoofprint at a time, through mud and snow, through famine and fair. Each bone and feather, each tail and hide told a story, not of savagery or waste, but of skill, necessity, and reverence. In the poorest village, or the richest court, the people knew the value of what they had, and so from the snort of a piglet to the last flick of a slaughtered ox's tail, every part lived on, shaped by hands calloused with memory, hunger, and the timeless art of making do. By the time midsummer arrived, with sun-drenched fields heavy with barley and hay, the memory of that brutal winter lingered only in softened leather boots, in glue-hardened furniture joints, in the bone flutes, still played under the shade of sycamore trees by shepherd boys who had watched lambs born from the very ooze that had survived, because the villagers knew how to stretch a beast into 100 uses. The village, though simple and removed from the machinations of kings and councils, had become a place where the rhythm of life pulsed in tandem with the animals that sustained it. Even those animals still living were now part of that deep, unspoken contract. Each piglet raised not just for the slab of meat it might yield, but for the hair that would bind bowstrings, for the fat that would seal jars and fuel lamps, for the hide that would make soles thick enough to weather the rocky path to the market. And at the heart of it all were the people, ordinary, unlettered, often hungry, but possessed of a knowledge so rich and rooted that even scholars in cathedral towns would marvel if they understood its full depth. For instance, on one sweltering day in July, when the sun beat down on the open commons and the cattle gathered in the shade to escape the flies, an old bull collapsed, its joints stiff from years of breeding and plough pulling, its heart finally giving out. There was a moment of silence when the beast fell, a pause that spread from the field to the cottages like a ripple on a pond, for every man and woman understood that this was not merely a loss but also a beginning. They moved quickly, not with panic but with the choreography of generations. The bull was too heavy to carry whole, so it was dismembered on the spot, the blood soaking into the dry earth, scaring away flies and drawing in dogs and crows. One leg was taken straight to the smithy, where the sinews were dried and twisted into string for the bellows, replacing worn cords. The hide was stripped in sheets and laid on the grass to cure beneath boards weighed with stones. The tail was given to the stable boy, who boiled it with roots and salt to make a thick jelly for his ailing grandfather, who claimed the broth eased the ache in his knees. The tongue, enormous and marbled with veins, was claimed by the baker's wife, who soaked it in vinegar, wrapped it in leaves, and roasted it slowly in her oven while baking bread, letting the juices drip into a pan she'd later use to make a rich stew flavored with leeks and garlic. The testicles, considered a delicacy by the village healer, were mashed with sage and marrow to be given as a tonic to childless couples. The bones, after the marrow was drawn out and slurped by the blacksmith's children, were hung in bundles from the barn to dry, some to be used as handles, some crushed into powder and scattered over garden beds, believed to bless the soil and improve the cabbages that grew in neat rows near the hedge. The hooves, collected in buckets, were again boiled into glue, this time thickened with ash for use in repairing a cracked wagon wheel that had long stood abandoned. The horns, massive and twisted, were carved into two halves, one shaped into a curved drinking vessel for the alehouse, polished and etched with a runic symbol of protection, the other heated and flattened into translucent sheets to be used as window panes in the manner, though blurry, they allowed in just enough light to soften the gloom inside, and when, days later, the animal's stomach lining was fully cleaned and dried, it was used to carry dried herbs, functioning as a poor man's pouch, and even stitched into an impromptu sieve for the brewer to filter sediment from his barley ales. No part was left. The village children watched, wide-eyed, as the old men talked of how, decades ago, in times of plague, even the cartilage from noses and ears had been dried and chewed by starving men, and though that horror was far away now, the respect for each part of the beast remained as sharp as the knives used to divide it. In another household, the rendered fat was poured over twine to make rushlights, poor imitations of candles, but still a source of light when the sun dipped and shadows crept into the corners of timber-framed homes. Further afield, in a sheep pen maintained by the Lord's Reeve, a ewe had died, giving birth to twins, one of which barely clung to life. The lamb was wrapped in the dead ewe's skin, a trick passed down for generations so that the living mother might accept it as her own, deceived by scent and touch. The rest of the ewe, her innards removed with practiced hands, was skinned with care, her intestines given to the village fiddler, who soaked and stretched them into chords for his bowed instruments, their sound echoing eerily through the night air during harvest festivals. Her milk, collected days earlier, was turned to cheese using the preserved lining from the calf's stomach. Her wool spun into fine thread used by the Lord's wife to embroider an altar cloth gifted to the chapel. Even her eyes were plucked and buried beneath the corner of a new sheepfold, a custom believed to protect flocks from illness and misfortune. Nearby, hunters returned with a wild boar, slain in the northern woods after days of tracking. Its tusks were sawed off and polished to adorn the belt of the captain of the guard, while its thick hide was tanned for armor. The meat was divided among the men, but the bristles, coarse and sharp, were bound into scrubbing brushes used to clean hearthstones and cauldrons. The heart was roasted with apples and served with coarse black bread, and the bladder, odd as it seemed, was inflated and dried, later used as a plaything for children who kicked it about with bare feet in the village green, laughter rising as the wind rustled through sun-bleached grass. In the cloistered silence of the nearby priory, monks copied scripture onto pages of vellum made from the skins of goats and calves, the parchment so finely scraped that light shone through it like clouded glass. They made ink from gallnuts and mixed it with ox bile for permanence, and the quills they used were plucked from geese raised for meat, each feather a prayer made tangible. Candles lit their work, made from sheep tallow, traded from the village, their scent faintly sour but reliable, and every book produced was not just knowledge preserved, but also a monument to the lives of dozens of animals, each part transformed into something sacred. Even the mats on which they knelt in prayer, were stuffed with horsehair, and the sandals on their feet had soles made from cowhide, stitched with sinew, smoothed with pig fat. Thus, even in the holiest of places, the traces of the farmyard and field clung to the air, humbling in their origin, and essential to the work of salvation. And so the cycle continued, through years of feast and years of famine, through births and deaths, marriages and funerals, plagues and pilgrimages, where each animal was a partner in survival, where the sum of its parts was not simply meat but meaning. There were no useless scraps, only overlooked opportunities. A village child might sleep on a mattress filled with straw and pig hair, tucked beneath a quilt sewn from sheepskin scraps, warmed by a fire lit with tallow-soaked kindling and watched by the glint of a horn window pane. He might dream of the dog at his feet, fed on boiled hooves and marrow, and awaken to the bleating of goats, or the crow of a rooster whose feathers would one day line his winter cloak. His first shoes would be stitched from goat hide, his school lessons scratched onto parchment made from a calf that died before spring. He would learn to string a bow with dried sinew, to call birds with a bone whistle, to chew fat for energy during harvest, and to thank the animal with a whispered word when the knife came out. This was the medieval world, dense with life and death, rich not in coin but in craft, where animals were not exploited for greed but honoured for their usefulness, each part repurposed until it yielded all it could. There was no waste, only the reshaping of form, a leg into a lantern, a horn into a hymn, a hide into a hymn book, a bladder into a child's game, a sinew into a song. And as the sun rose again over that timeless village, casting golden light across hedges and stone walls, it caught in the glint of a horn cup, in the smooth edge of a bone buckle, in the soot-darkened hide hanging in the tanner's yard, and in the quiet eyes of the oxen waiting their turn, not just to die, but to become everything. As the seasons turned once more, slipping slowly from the golden haze of late summer into the crisp sharpness of autumn, the work of animals did not lessen but rather deepened in meaning, for the harvest now depended not only on human labour, but on the enduring strength of the beasts who hauled the grain carts, trampled the threshing floors, and gave their bodies to the very tools of the field. Along the edges of the barley fields, villagers could be seen walking alongside the oxen teams, their whips used less for punishment and more as guides, their hands stroking tired flanks as the wheels of the laden carts groaned beneath the weight of barley, rye and oats. Once the harvest was in, the celebrations began, but not with the waste of modern feasts, for the villagers knew that what was gathered must last, and what was taken must be honoured. In the manor's kitchen, a sow was slaughtered for the Lord's harvest banquet, and from the moment her squeal echoed across the courtyard to the instant her last scraps of skin were rendered down, her body was the centerpiece of more than just the table. It was the source of candles for the chapel, lard for baking, bristles for brushes used to scrub the stone floors, and the tender flesh from her flanks cured in salt and smoke to be stored for the coming winter. Her bladder, once emptied and cleaned, was used to carry dried herbs to the wise woman who lived near the wood's edge, her ointments made from pig fat and elderflowers curing boils, rashes and even fevers when the wind turned ill. The intestines of the sow were washed meticulously, tied off with sinew, and hung in loops from the rafters, waiting to be filled with seasoned meat for sausages that would be slowly dried over the hearth. The ears were boiled and fed to the dogs, who wagged their tails beneath the feasting tables hoping for scraps, while the hooves were immediately sent to the blacksmith's son, who boiled them in a great iron pot to make glue used in binding axe handles and hammerheads. Even the teeth of the animal were not forgotten, tied into small pouches as protective charms, and worn by children around their necks or hung from doorways to keep away spirits said to ride the autumn winds. The blood, rich and dark, was stirred into cauldrons with grains and onions to make blood pudding, served warm with black bread and salted butter, churned by hand with milk taken from goats who watched from their pens, oblivious to the fate of their porcine companion. As the meat smoked and the hides stretched on wooden racks, the tallow was poured into moulds shaped like saints and animals, forming candles that would flicker through long church services and the silent work of scribes copying sermons onto calfskin parchment. In the church, the altar cloth was hemmed with pigot thread, its sturdy resilience praised by the priest who remembered a time when even linen was rare. The font, though made of stone, was rubbed down with fat to keep it smooth and free from cracks in the cold, and the benches upon which the villagers sat had joints held together by glues made from hooves and hides long since sacrificed. Across the village, women gathered in spinning circles, twisting wool from sheep who had given their fleece in spring and would soon give their lives before the first snow. The lanolin left on the raw wool was prized as a salve for hands cracked by harvest scythes and scalding cauldrons, and the scraps too coarse for cloth were stuffed into bedding or layered into clothing to keep in warmth. When the reeve called the census of livestock, it was not only to count what animals might live through the winter, but to calculate what uses they might serve even in death. The number of candle moulds that could be filled, the number of hides that could be cured, the amount of sinew that could be dried and twisted into bowstrings or cordage for trapping birds and tying bundles of herbs. Children learned early which bones were best for whistles, which feathers made the finest quills, which hairs from a pig's back could be bound into the stiff brushes used by monks to scrub the floor of the scriptorium. Nothing was without use, and every part of the animal, once understood, became a tool, a token, or a gift. In the hunts that followed the harvest, deer were brought down not only for their meat, but for the thick hides used in winter cloaks, the antlers carved into cups, beads, and arrowheads, the sinews turned into thread, the stomachs boiled and stretched into drumheads for the musicians who played during Saints' Day processions. Even the lungs of the animal, which some would consider waste, were boiled into soup or mixed with grain for dog feed, and the very shape of the skulls was used in folk medicine, their hollow eyes filled with flowers or herbs, and placed on grave mounds to ensure safe passage for the dead. During one particularly heavy rainstorm that flooded the lower fields and drove rats into the granary, a cat was found drowned, swept away in the rushing water. Though sorrowful, the animal was not buried without ceremony. Its fur, still soft, was clipped and saved for stuffing a pillow. Its claws, tied with red thread, were hung above the grain sacks as a charm against vermin. Its bones were buried at the edge of the field to appease the spirits of the earth, believed by some to be angered by the taking of grain without offerings. That same day, an old goat passed in its sleep, too worn from years of giving milk and walking stony paths to survive the damp. Its meat was tough but nourishing when stewed with barley, its hide tanned and shaped into a water skin, and its horns fashioned into handles for knives used in the kitchen. Even the ashes from the bones, after they were burned in the cook fire, were scattered into the herb garden as fertilizer. In these acts there was no sentimentality born of detachment, only a deep and enduring respect for the interconnectedness of all things. When a cow died of old age the following week, its death was marked by both mourning and industry. Her hide was large and thick, perfect for the cobbler who had been saving scraps for a pair of boots needed before the frost. Her milk, still warm in her udders, was shared with the children before her body was taken apart by the village's skilled hands. Her horns, long and curved, were carefully carved into scoops and ladles, and her bones, once boiled, were dried and powdered into lime used in both cleaning and treating the leather made from her skin. Her heart was split open by the healer, who read the lines in its muscle as signs of the seasons to come, and her blood was collected and stirred into a basin with herbs for painting protective sigils onto door lintels, a practice half religious, half pagan, but entirely believed. Even her eyes, clouded with age, were buried in a field of beans, thought to give sight to the next year's harvest. Thus the wheel of use turned ceaselessly, not from cruelty or wastefulness, but from a necessity that became reverence. The people of the medieval world could not afford to waste, and so their ingenuity turned every sinew into a solution, every scrap into a story. A dead chicken's feathers might stuff a winter cloak, its feet boiled into broth, its beak strung onto a charm for protection against bad dreams. A goose's wing might become a broom, a quill, a fan, or a bellows for stoking the blacksmith's fire. When a horse died in the farthest pasture, its bones were used to make tent pegs, its tail braided into ropes, its hide stretched into strong armor for a guardsman's shoulder, and its teeth strung into a counting device for a scribe. Even the manure of the animals became crucial, spread over fields, packed into walls with straw for insulation, and sometimes dried into bricks burned as fuel when wood was scarce. The filth of one season became the warmth of another, and what came from the earth returned to it. In this cycle, the people saw a mirror of themselves. Just as they returned to the soil, so too did the animals, but not before their parts had served many lives, many purposes. They believed, even if they could not always say it aloud, that this was the way of things, not just survival, but participation in a sacred continuity. To waste a bone was to offend the spirit of the creature, to use it wisely was to thank it. In the last days of autumn, as frost began to edge the wooden fences and the last of the apples fell from the orchard trees, the village gathered for the yearly reckoning, the tally of stores, of meat cured and hides dried, of candles made and shoes stitched. The steward's ledger, bound in pigskin and written with a quill from a barn goose, told the story of the year in numbers, but the real story was written across every roof patched with hide, every hearth warmed by tallow, every stew thickened by bones and marrow. And so they prepared for winter again, with faith not just in their prayers, but in their knowledge, their hands and their understanding that every living thing, once gone, left behind something useful, something sacred, something that in being used carried life forward. The animals that shared their world were more than beasts of burden. They were threads in a grand tapestry of survival and meaning, and through the careful use of every part, the people of the Middle Ages told their story, not in books or monuments, but in blood, bone, hide and horn. In the lingering smoke of meat cured by wisdom, in the silent blessing of a cow's hide warming a child through the snow, in the low flicker of a pig tallow candle lighting a prayer on a long frozen night. As the first snow began to fall in faint, swirling flakes that melted on the woolen cloaks of the villagers and vanished into the damp earth before settling, the landscape transformed into a world of silence and scarcity. The fields, once alive with rustling grain and braying oxen, now lay still beneath a quilt of white, and the animals that had survived the culling of autumn huddled together in sheds lined with straw and dung, their breath rising in clouds as visible as ghosts in the crisp air. It was now, in this liminal season between harvest and hunger, that the full measure of the village's resourcefulness was put to the test. The meat salted in summer hung in bundles from smoke-blackened beams above the hearths. The fat rendered into tallow glowed in slow-burning candles tucked into wall sconces made from hollowed antlers or bits of shellacked bone, and the gloves on every calloused hand, the boots on frost-bitten feet, the thick cloaks that shielded children from the cold, all bore testament to the beasts that had given their flesh not just for nourishment but for comfort and survival. In the Reeves house, a sheepskin rug stretched across the floor near the fire where his aging mother lay coughing, wrapped in a quilt stitched together from bits of goat hide and scraps of linen stuffed with tufts of wool too short to spin. Beside her, a ladle carved from the hollow of a bull's horn rested in a bowl of thin broth made from marrow bones, boiled for hours until the fat rose in shimmering circles, and a bit of garlic and turnip gave flavour to what would otherwise have been only memory. In the smithy, where the cold made metal brittle and fire a sacred necessity, the bellows puffed steadily thanks to the sinew straps cut from oxen long dead, and the walls were patched with layers of hide nailed to keep out the wind that whistled like a keening voice through the chinks in the boards. Hoof glue, boiled and thickened in a cracked iron pot, was used to mend tool handles, to affix broken cartwheels, to repair the bindings of the butcher's well-used cleavers. A boy stood barefoot near the anvil, stuffing goat hair into the gaps in his shoes, tightening the pigskin straps around his ankles with frozen fingers, while his father hammered nails made from salvaged iron into the wooden runners of a small sled used to ferry wood and dried dung from barn to hearth. In the small chapel at the centre of the village, the priest, half blind from age and cataracts, lit candles that burned low and steady, their wicks blackened, their light dim but blessed. The waxy scent of sheep tallow hung in the air, mixing with the damp of stone and the faint aroma of burning incense made from dried herbs and resin traded with a traveller in autumn. The priest's hands were wrapped in gloves with patched fingers, the leather softened by lard and stitched with deer sinew. He opened his prayer book bound in pigskin, the pages made of vellum so thin and tightly stretched that the ink gleamed where it had been traced with a quill once part of a swan's wing. In every home the evidence of the animals' second lives could be seen. Children played with dolls stuffed with sheep wool, their hair made from pig bristles dyed with root dyes, their clothes stitched from scraps of rabbit fur. In the hearth, the iron cauldron, blackened from decades of use, bubbled with a stew that contained the tail of a cow, some bits of pig jowl, lentils and wild garlic. The wooden spoons that stirred it had handles reinforced with bone, and the cups into which the broth was poured were shaped from horn or carved from antler, the sides polished with tallow and fat, so that they shone faintly in the firelight. A man sat by the fire sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the handle of the blade carved from the rib bone of a deer shot 2 winters before, the knife itself resting in a sheath made from hardened cowhide, dyed dark with boiled walnut husks. A dog dozed nearby, his collar made from braided hide and studded with pig teeth, a charm meant to ward off spirits of the night. Far from the village, in a hunter's cabin buried beneath the snowdrifts along the forest's edge, a solitary man stirred a pot over a fire built from pine and dried dung. The thick furs he wore had once belonged to bears and wolves, stitched together with sinew and trimmed with foxtails to block the wind that cut through the gaps in the logs of his shelter. His snowshoes were laced with rawhide, his bow strung with gut, and his arrows fletched with goose feathers and tipped with antler. Hanging from the rafters were strips of dried venison, and on a peg near the door, his mittens lined with rabbit skin and patched with hide, lay drying from the damp of the trail. Even in isolation, even in the depth of winter's silence, the echo of animal life surrounded him. A bundle of sinew cords hung from a hook, waiting to be twisted into trap triggers, while a carved bear femur served as a spindle for twisting wool taken from a sheep he had traded for before the snows came. And still within the village, the tanner continued his slow, smelly work in the outer quarter, where the air reeked of lime, urine and soaked hides. Even in winter, his vats steamed and boys with cloths tied over their mouths scraped flesh from skins already stiff with cold. The hides of cows and goats, scraped, soaked, stretched on wooden frames and weighed down with rocks, would in time become belts, bags, book bindings and shoes. Some would be cut into thongs for binding carts or tethering animals, others shaped into armour, and still others boiled and hardened into sheaths for the swords carried by the Lord's men-at-arms. The bones left over from butchering were hauled to his yard, where they were sorted by size and shape, some for tools, others for glue, others for carving. A small girl, daughter of the leather worker, carried a basket of bone buttons her father had carved the night before, polished with fat and rubbed with ash to dull their colour. She brought them to the seamstress who worked by lamplight, patching the lord's cloak with thread made from twisted gut and stitches small enough to be mistaken for embroidery. The work never stopped, not even when the sun barely rose before sinking again, not even when the snow lay waist-deep in drifts. Men built sleds of bone and hide, lined their cloaks with furs sewn from squirrel and rabbit, shaped needles from bird bone to mend gloves worn thin by frost. In one house, a cradle made from bent wood and stuffed with straw was cushioned by sheepskin and hung by cords made of braided sinew. Within it slept an infant swaddled in a wrap dyed with ox blood and rabbit urine, warm despite the air so cold it froze the water in the cup beside the bed. His mother, weary and hungry, chewed on a strip of dried meat taken from the hoof of a pig, soaked in vinegar and wrapped in herbs, believed to strengthen the blood of a woman who had recently given birth. Her face was lit by candlelight, flickering against the curved horn of the lantern, and at her feet lay the remnants of a deer's leg, sawed in half for marrow, the bone saved for carving into a scoop for flour. By the time the frost began to melt, by the time the birds returned to the hedges and the sheep began to lamb again in the folds beneath the hills, the people had survived another winter, not through luck or faith alone, but through labour, knowledge and the full, intricate use of every animal whose life had passed into theirs. Nothing had been wasted, and in every cottage, every barn, every yard, the silent legacy of those animals endured. A belt, a ladle, a patch of hide, a string of gut, a needle of bone, a candle of fat, a spoon of horn, a toy of wool, a sling of hide, a cup of horn, a charm of teeth, a book of parchment, a buckle of antler, a saddle of leather, a soap of tallow, a shoe of pigskin, a net of sinew, a whip of braided hair, each one a monument to that eternal relationship, that pact forged without words between people and beasts, where every part was honoured, used, and made to serve life beyond death, meaning beyond meat, survival not through conquest but through craft. And as the village came back to life with the turning of the year, it did so on the backs, bones, and breath of animals whose silent giving had ensured the people once again endured. As spring rolled over the thawing land like a timid visitor, the villagers shook the winter's hush from their shoulders and stepped again into fields spongy with melted snow, their boots dampened by slush and their breath warmer now, no longer frosting the air in steady clouds. In the stables and barns, the animals that had survived the frost and the lean months, some gaunt, some sickly, all essential, were coaxed from their stalls, their dung-laden straw replaced, their hooves cleaned with bone picks passed down for generations, carved smooth from ox shin and rubbed with pig fat to seal the grain. Life stirred cautiously, lambs bleated under the watchful eyes of shepherds whose cloaks were stitched from the very wool they once sheared. Calves stumbled on knobby legs beside their lowing mothers, and hens pecked tentatively at the cold ground, the first to test the earth's promise. Yet even in this season of renewal, death played its role, and every loss was not a sorrow wasted, but a resource reclaimed. A sick goat, its flank riddled with worms and appetite gone, was slaughtered quietly near the stream, its hide peeled with practiced grace and stretched taut on a wooden frame. The meat, lean and bitter, was simmered for the dogs, or chopped finely and mixed with nettles for those too poor to mind taste. Its blood was caught in a bowl and stirred with barley flour, onions, and wild thyme to make blood pudding, and its bones, boiled until soft, were crushed under stone to feed the soil in gardens just now waking beneath the frost. The horns were sawn off, polished and hollowed, one to become a powder horn for the reeve's son who dabbled in early firearms, the other carved into a comb for the smith's wife, who sat by candlelight, teasing lice from her daughter's braid. Elsewhere, a pig that had slipped on the icy ground midwinter and broken a leg was finally dispatched with prayers and swift mercy. Its carcass, preserved by the cold where it lay under straw, was now brought forth to be rendered fully useful. The hams were salted again and set in brine, the belly sliced thin for bacon, the fat melted down in great blackened cauldrons that lined the village green, tallow and lard to be used for greasing boots, softening hides, sealing windows, and frying the last of the root vegetables. The ears and snout were boiled and pickled for those who favoured such texture, and the intestines, meticulously turned inside out, scrubbed with ash and vinegar, were repurposed not only as sausage casings, but also twisted into cords for tying bundles of herbs, or serving as tension lines for musical instruments like the velo or rebec. Even the pig's bladder, inflated and dried, would serve as a child's toy, painted with soot and berry juice, and batted about the yard with a stick. Its tail, curled tightly even in death, was tied with a ribbon and hung over the lintel as a charm to bring fertility to the household's hens, a superstition honoured without question. Throughout the spring, as warmth coaxed the green from the hedgerows and birdsong returned to the mornings, the rhythm of life resumed with fresh urgency, and with it came the renewed demand for animals, both living and processed. The cobbler who had spent winter stitching pigskin shoes for children now busied himself with making soles from cowhide so thick it had to be soaked for days before he could pierce it with his awl, an awl whose handle was antler, its shaft bound in place with sinew. A nobleman passing through the village on his way north required a new saddle girth, and the tanner's apprentice, his arms stained to the elbow with lye and dog dung, laboured for 3 days to produce one strong enough from hardened strips of hide soaked in brine and tempered with rendered sheep fat. In the market square, a trader offered for sale bundles of sheep gut twisted into harp strings, pots of glue made from hooves, brushes with bristles from swine and boar, and scrolls of parchment, some so finely scraped and bleached they almost shone in the sunlight. Monks from a nearby priory arrived seeking vellum for transcribing holy texts, and they bartered with honey, wax, and prayers for a bundle of clean, stretched calf skins scraped thin and pale, their surface perfect for ink made from gall and iron. Meanwhile, women in the village prepared for births and deaths alike. Midwives sewed birthing cloths from linen patched with lambskin, soft enough to wrap around a newborn, while apothecaries ground antlers into powder for poultices, mixing it with beeswax and crushed herbs in small clay pots sealed with goat tallow. Aged villagers afflicted by joint pain chewed leather scraps soaked in a brew of barley and marrow, believing the strength of the beast might pass into their bones. Children, running through fields ankle-deep in mud, swung slings made from braided hide and stuffed their pockets with dice carved from sheep knuckles, their laughter echoing beneath the trees. When a beloved hunting hound died of a snake bite near the edge of the forest, its pelt was not buried, but stretched and sewn into a lining for the Lord's gauntlets. Its death, though mourned, turned useful, its spirit honoured not with tears but by continued service. In late spring, with the arrival of lambing season and the festival of Saint Walpurga, the villagers gathered in celebration, and with celebration came feasting. A goat, selected for its size and condition, was slaughtered with ceremonial care. Its skull was cleaned and placed on a pole beside the fire, its meat roasted slowly, the offal fried with onions and spiced with elderflower vinegar. Children carried ribbons woven from wool to decorate the trees, and women sang songs passed down since before parchment bore names. The goat's horns were awarded to the baker, who ground them into ash for use in his leavening mix, and its hoofs were boiled to make gelatin for jellied eels. Not even its eyes went to waste. They were buried beneath the herb gardens, believed to protect crops from blight and the gaze of jealous neighbours. The festivities ended with the lighting of a great bonfire, fueled in part by dried dung and bone from animals long gone, the smoke a fragrant mingling of memory, sacrifice and purpose. As summer approached, the village swelled with trade and travel. Roads now passable brought peddlers carrying furs from the north and glass beads from the south. They bartered with smoked haunches, bone needles, and horn cups. The innkeeper, preparing for guests, lined his benches with cured hide, restuffed straw mattresses with horsehair, and ordered new ladles carved from marrowbone. He offered broth thickened with pig's feet gelatin, flavoured with leeks and salted fish, and served on trenchers made from hardened cowhide where bread was scarce. Travellers carried flasks made from sheep stomachs and boots waterproofed with beeswax and cow grease, and in the cool of the evening they sat near fires lit with dried dung, telling tales of beasts hunted and markets bustling far from the village. In the shadow of the village chapel, a carver worked on a small crucifix commissioned by the priest. It was made from horn and bone, smoothed until it glowed like ivory, the Christ figure carved from deer antler, his face worn with care, and his limbs etched in loving detail. The base of the cross bore inlay from cow horn, the whole piece oiled with rendered lard to preserve it through time and weather. When it was finally placed on the altar, the villagers knelt in reverence, not only to the divine, but to the craft and sacrifice stitched invisibly into every curve, every gleam. Behind the altar, the church book sat on a lectern covered in stretched goat hide, its pages made from calf skin, its spine bound with sinew, the ink traced from ash, gall, and the iron left in animal blood. Worship itself was shaped and sheltered by the beasts who had given everything, and so, as the seasons turned, as the green deepened to gold and then to brown, the villagers never forgot the thread that tied their world together, never lost reverence for the lives they took and reshaped. From cradle to coffin, every man, woman and child was swaddled, sustained and sheltered by the legacy of animals whose deaths were never idle, never wasteful. A pair of oxen who had ploughed fields for a decade were finally slaughtered before winter, their tongues pickled for the steward's table, their horns made into inkhorns for scribes, their hides wrapped around barrels to keep out damp, and their bones saved for knives, tools, and once more, fertilizer. Their memory lived not in words, but in every sturdy thing built from their body, every warm glove, every drop of soup. Even the worms that would one day feast on the flesh of those who had taken these gifts would do so from within coffins sealed with hide glue, their final resting clothes dyed with blood and bone, their rosaries strung on gut, their grave lights lit by tallow candles melted from beasts who once roamed green fields under the sun. For the medieval world was not one of convenience, nor cruelty, but of necessity woven with reverence, of survival earned through labour, and of death transfigured into use. The village's very soul was stitched with tendon, written on parchment, clad in hide, and sustained by meat, milk, blood, and bone. To live was to take, but always to use, to waste nothing, and in doing so, to honour that which gave itself so that others might persist. And in this quiet covenant, this unspoken pact between human and beast, a rough kind of immortality was promised, not of soul or spirit, but of purpose. Long after breath had ceased and flesh was gone, the horn would be held, the parchment read, the candle burned. And in each of these, the animal lived again, and with the slow death of summer giving way to the ripening of autumn, the air turned crisp and carried the scent of apples, wood smoke, and drying meat, signalling a season both of harvest and of reckoning. This was the time when every choice carried weight, when every animal's life was weighed with urgency and reverence, for what could be spared to survive the winter had to be prepared with care, and what could not be fed through the lean months was offered to the larder and fire. Herds were thinned with deliberation, old ewes, sickly goats, and surplus cockerels, each selected not only by their weakness, but also by their potential to nourish and endure in new forms. The villagers, sleeves rolled and blades honed, turned to the ancient and solemn work of slaughter. In the great yard behind the longhouse, the butcher worked from dawn until dusk, assisted by boys too young to cut but strong enough to drag, to carry, to hang. One after another, beasts were dispatched quickly with prayers whispered and blood caught in basins. Chickens were dunked in boiling water to loosen feathers, plucked and saved for stuffing winter garments, their gizzards and livers separated for pies, rich with nutmeg and dried berries, and their small bones dried for broth or finely crushed into calcium-rich powder to be added to bread for the elderly. Ducks yielded down for bedding and wings for fans used in kitchens or chapels, and even their beaks were carved into decorative toggles and tools for children's games. The pigs, however, were the crown of autumn's offering. Each part of the animal was spoken for even before the final breath left its snout. The butchering of a large boar brought the village together in quiet ritual, not of mourning but of stewardship, and the scene unfolded like theatre honed by centuries. The flesh was trimmed into roasts, chops, sausages, the fat rendered and sealed in stone jars, white and solid as snow. But beyond the expected cuts lay a wealth of utility. The brain was mixed with herbs and vinegar to make a curative poultice for bruises. The spine was dried and sharpened into skates for winter games played upon frozen ponds, and the thick hide, once scraped and brined, was pegged down for tanning, destined to become harnesses, belts, and even window coverings in homes too poor for glass. The bladder, inflated once again, was painted with scenes of harvest and saints, strung from branches as both decoration and plaything. From the pig's stomach, villagers crafted haggis and carried it reverently to feasts where it was sliced open with knives of antler and cheered with mugs of ale. Even the soot from burning bones was collected, mixed with fat and ash to polish armor and tools. Cows kept longer for milk and calves were not often slaughtered unless old or infirm, and when one did fall, it was as if an elder had passed. A cow's body was immense in its offering. Its stomachs, each chambered and unique, were cleaned and used to store fermented milk or rennet. Its hooves made glue, its tail a switch for keeping flies from kitchens or turning pages in scriptoriums. Its great sinews bound into the bowstrings of huntsmen or the cords of pulley hoists. The horns were hollowed and carved, turned into spoons, drinking vessels, and even lantern casings filled with tallow and a floating wick, their curved surface etched with vines and stars. Cowhide, thick and durable, was soaked and beaten, destined for water buckets, shield covers, or the soles of the reeves' boots. The great bones, femurs and ribs were split and scraped into handles for scythes, sled runners for children, and braces for broken limbs. No part lay unclaimed, no piece went without function. As the leaves fell and were raked into garden beds for mulch, the cycle of gratitude and reuse continued. Horses, though rarely eaten, found their utility extended even after death. When one died of age or accident, its hide became tack, its mane was braided into brushes or ritual cords for processions, and its teeth, massive and white, were sometimes set into wood as decorative inlays or good luck charms, especially among those who believed a horse's spirit warded off ill omens. The marrow of its bones was fed to dogs or used as bait for trapping foxes, and in some remote corners, where famine once bit hard, even the horse's lean meat was dried and salted, hidden behind closed doors, consumed without talk. Donkeys, smaller and shaggier cousins, served similarly, and their softer hides made durable gloves or book bindings, while their tails, when dried and stiffened, were strung with bells and used in religious ceremonies that required both music and movement. Throughout the village, every home echoed this reverent reuse. Antlers hung above hearths for luck or dried herbs, chickens walked amid bones not yet crushed, and children learned the differences between sheep horn and goat horn by touch, by smell, by use. The healer's hut smelled of beeswax and rendered lard, shelves lined with small pots of ointments made from bone ash, ground hoof, and blood glue, used for everything from chapped lips to battlefield wounds. Even the village bell ringer used a bone to strike the bell's flank, believing the sound cleaner more holy than iron. Across the fields, scarecrows were dressed in old cowhide jackets, stiff with salt and smoke, and strings of dried pig ears clattered in the wind to frighten crows. Every place bore the mark of the animal, transformed from flesh to object, from life to legacy. The monastery on the hill, too, bore witness to the beasts. Monks who copied scriptures did so on calfskin vellum, painstakingly stretched and scraped, every page a testament to sacrifice and devotion. The ink they used came from iron mixed with gall taken from oaks and bound with the blood of slaughtered goats or roosters. The pens were quills, sometimes from geese, but often from bones sharpened and split, dipped in dark ink and steadied by hands calloused from prayer and labour. Their candles were not of beeswax too dear, but of tallow, thick and greasy, their smoke heavy but necessary to see through long nights. Even their sandals were of hide, their belts from goat, their rosaries strung on sinew, the cross they kissed made of carved horn, polished smooth by centuries of lips and hope. By the time winter again laid its hand across the land, the village stood not as a place separate from animals, but a living museum of them, every corner infused with the remains of their bodies, their usefulness reincarnated in endless forms. Meat hung in smokehouses, hides frozen on racks outside homes, and sinew cords bound shutters tight against the wind. Children slept beneath blankets stuffed with wool and feather, mothers stirred pots with bone-handled ladles, and fathers sat sharpening knives against whetstones embedded with powdered hoof. Dogs chewed happily on joint bones, cats batted dried pig bladders around the hearth, and chickens scratched in the ash pile, pecking at bits of gristle. The living and the dead coexisted in harmony, not as predators and prey, but as participants in an unbroken chain of need and gratitude. Even the graveyard was touched by this cycle, coffins sealed with hide, shrouds stitched with gut, candles of tallow flickering in the chapel during requiem mass, their light fed by beasts whose lives now gave peace to the departed. And through it all, the villagers remembered, not in stories or songs, but in hands that knew how to render sinew from leg, to strip hide from flank, to crush bone for broth or blade. It was not magic that sustained them, nor wealth, nor the grace of lords. It was this unending, respectful transformation. The world was made not only of what they had, but what they kept, what they did not waste. Even in hunger, even in cold, the knowledge that no death was purposeless carried them through. And when, in rare moments of rest, someone looked at a comb or a candle or a cradle and remembered the sheep or the sow or the ox from which it came, there was no sorrow, only a quiet, enduring thanks. The beast was gone, but its use was not. In marrow and muscle, in bristle and bone, it lived on in the tools that built the home, in the food that stilled the hunger, in the hands that shaped the next thing and the next. Thus did the medieval people survive, not only by toil but by transformation, not only by labour but by reverence, and in the quiet reuse of every part of the animals around them, they found something more lasting than flesh. They found continuity, and in that, a kind of immortality, and so the days trudged on with the steady rhythm of breath and work, of frost creeping over the land, and the last of the apples pressed into sweet sharp cider stored in old pigskin flasks, sewn tight with goat gut thread, hidden beneath floorboards to ferment beside smoked fish, wrapped in dried sheep's stomachs. In every hut, in every cart, in every church pew and farmyard spade, there pulsed the silent legacy of the beasts whose flesh, blood, and hide had become the village's sinews. use. The tanners worked tirelessly, stirring great vats of oak bark brew with long rods carved from cowbone, lowering hides into the liquid where they would soak for months, softening, transforming, their smell rising in bitter clouds to mix with wood smoke and damp earth. Tanning was a sacred alchemy, one that could take the reeking, blood-soaked skin of a beast and turn it into the supple straps that held together ploughs, cloaks, girdles, and pouches. The leather from oxen covered shields held by militiamen and lined the insides of wagon wheels that churned through mud when merchants made their way to distant towns. Every scrap was precious. Children played with the offcuts, fashioning dolls from scraps of hide, their tiny heads stuffed with horsehair or shorn wool too short to spin, and their eyes sewn with dried berries or old buttons carved from horn or hoof. During the long evenings, by the hearth where the family gathered to mend tools and patch garments, stories were told of beasts that had fed them in hard years. They spoke of a mighty sow named Grethel, who had once birthed 20 piglets and saved the village from a cruel winter, and of the ancient ram whose horns now served as handles on the door of the chapel, twisting silently in the cold. These stories were not merely of animals but of kin, of contributors, each tale carrying with it the invisible thread of gratitude that ran through their lives like veins under skin. In barns, men sharpened their blades not with violence but with care, running whetstones gently over steel as their fathers had taught them, whispering prayers not to gods of war or fire, but to those of harvest, patience, and the right death. Every slaughter was done with the knowledge that the body would not be wasted, that even the gall, the bitterest fluid, would find purpose, used by scribes to mix ink that would copy laws and psalms onto parchment made from calfskin bound between boards of horn-pressed leather. As winter tightened its grip, a layer of snow blanketed the fields, and the world outside fell into silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the huff of oxen breath. In this white stillness, the work continued indoors. Women spun wool soaked with lanolin scraped from sheepskins, their spindles made from chicken bones or carved swan necks, turning slowly between cold fingers, while children threaded fish bones into charms to ward off hunger and evil spirits. The bones of beasts were also fashioned into flutes that shepherds played as they watched over small flocks in snow-drifted pastures, the hollow tones floating across the hills like a memory. In monasteries, monks heated bones and hooves until they became gelatin, pouring it into molds made of antler to create inks, seals, or waxed bindings, their chants echoing down halls where candlelight flickered on walls lined with horn sconces and deer-hide scrolls. Dogs, loyal and shaggy, gnawed on joints too tough to boil, while cats leapt after strings of sinew dangled from rafters, and even rats in the granary gnawed quietly on discarded hoof trimmings, their presence both loathed and grudgingly accepted, for they too had their role in this world of flesh and decay. In distant corners of the village, old women collected scraps others had overlooked, beef tendon, rabbit sinew, dried duck webbing, and repurposed them into everything from doll shoes to bindings for books of herbal lore. It was said that the oldest among them could tell the age of an ox by the curve of its ribs, or the breed of a chicken by the shape of its leg bone, and in truth, their hands knew better than most how to distinguish the useful from the waste, though to them, waste did not exist. The world was a tapestry of usefulness, where every dead thing whispered of its potential to serve. As spring approached and the days lengthened, the melt revealed hides still nailed to tanning frames and bones hung from trees to bleach in the sun. Boys climbed trees to collect bird feathers for fletching arrows, and girls helped their mothers sort horn into combs, fastened together with pitch and gut. Horn was not merely an adornment, but a material prized for its strength and beauty. It became lantern windows, drinking horns, powder flasks, and even inlays for knife handles and furniture. Craftsmen in market towns traded in it eagerly, and the finest horn carvers were revered alongside blacksmiths and weavers. No lesser was the art of making glue from boiled hooves and bones, a pungent but vital substance used to hold together everything from wagon frames to stringed instruments, a reminder that even decay had its role in creation. And when midsummer came and the fields turned gold once more, the beasts of burden returned to their work, oxen dragging ploughs, goats clearing brush, dogs herding sheep, and horses pulling carts of hay. Their bodies glistened with sweat, their hooves clattering on stones polished smooth by the tread of generations, yet all who watched them work also knew that these creatures were both present and future, living tools, yes, but also future food, future shoes, future ink, future song. A child might pat the flank of a cow and drink its milk today, knowing that in 5 winters he might sleep wrapped in a blanket, stuffed with its hide trimmings, rid by candlelight from a scroll written on its skin, and be healed with balm mixed in a jar, sealed with its horn. There was no sentimentality in this, but there was profound respect. The animal was not separate from the human world. It was threaded through it, knotted into every life and death, every prayer and possession. Even the village festivals bore this imprint. In the midsummer feast, when meat was rare and the earth's bounty celebrated, symbolic offerings were made, not in gold or coin, but in tokens made of animal remains. Pig bones carved into whistles, ox horns into drinking vessels passed from hand to hand, and sheep scapulae painted with plant dyes and thrown into the bonfire as wishes for a good harvest. Some families kept a single item from each slaughtered animal, a bone pendant, a carved hoof cup, a tail tuft braided into a child's hair, reminders of what had been given and what had been gained. It was said that those who forgot to give thanks, who buried bones without use or let hides rot in the sun, would suffer poor harvests, sickly livestock, and dreams haunted by eyes of animals unremembered. Thus did the cycle continue, not merely of birth and death, but of form and function, where one thing became another and another, endlessly. A chicken became a meal, then a feather quill, then the story written by that quill. A cow became milk, then leather, then the saddle under a merchant, then the boot of a pilgrim walking to Canterbury. A deer became food for the Lord's table, then sinew for his bowstring, then glue in the chapel that held fast the carved angels of the rood screen. And in every transformation, the spirit of the animal endured, not in superstition, but in memory, in use, in the quiet reverence of those who knew how to take without wasting, who knew that to consume without gratitude was to turn one's back on the very earth that gave. In this way, the medieval people lived not by might or miracle, but by mastery of the materials at hand, and none more sacred or omnipresent than the animal. The beasts that walked beside them, that fed them and warmed them, and clothed them and built their tools and shaped their rituals, were not separate from the story of their survival. They were the story. And as the centuries passed and the tools changed and the markets grew and the bells told new names, the truth of that story lingered, etched in bone, carved in horn, stitched into hides buried beneath the stones of ancient barns and chapels. For so long as people needed warmth, light, food, healing and story, they would return again and again to the body of the animal and find there not only sustenance but meaning.